here we go with this January 6th case, which is also under the auspices of Jack Smith, who's similarly in charge of the Espionage Act case. And he decided to resurrect the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which doesn't alone make the bringing of the charges unwarranted. I mean, an old statute can still be a relevant statute, but the issue here with this particular charge, conspiracy against rights, is that it's a wholly novel application of this statute specifically tailored to criminalize Trump's conduct. So a hallmark of criminal law, or at least the rational application of criminal law, you would think, is that a violation of a law foreseeable to a reasonable person, meaning a reasonable person should be able to know or readily intuit or predict that their conduct would be in violation of the law. And that requires that a law not be subject to these creative extrapolations to encompass a vast array of conduct that wouldn't have been initially contemplated as criminalizable under the statute. Okay, so I spoke to one of the defense counsels who's representing a co-conspirator in this indictment, John Eastman, who came up with the cockamamie theory about Pence having the authority to discard electoral votes or count rival slates of electoral votes that have been submitted by Trump electors in the 6 supposedly contested states. And his view is that at 81 years old, this guy is the founder of FIRE, the Civil Liberties Organization, longtime defense attorney who's represented anti-war activists, minority activists over the years. He views this as one of the most ominous infringements on the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights writ large that he's really been involved with in his career. Because what are they doing? They're taking what had been previously understood to be political activity and political speech, which you may disagree with, and you may vigorously want to dispute. At the time, I was very much in opposition to a lot of these theories around election fraud that were being propagated by the Trump campaign and right-wing media. And I was, furiously debating with people who were trying to claim that there was some inherent authority of the vice president to unilaterally exercise his own discretion to decide which electoral votes to count. Okay, so I was against that theory on a political level. But the problem here is now that they've transferred it into the domain of criminal law, which is a fairly stark Rubicon crossing thing to do, because now you're probably going to see, this seems to be ushering in, or could have the potential to usher in, a new era where rival political factions are now going to be much more incentivized to wield the apparatus of punitive criminal law or punitive criminal state power to basically resolve their political disputes with other factions.
Okay. So can I interject here, and then you can respond? I want to respond to some of your things, and then you can respond to what I say. So let's start with the idea, the notion that this is like about free speech. If Donald Trump had just done 25, 50, 100 rallies downplaying the results of the election, saying he won even though he didn't, and all that stuff, and he never did the fake electors slates, he never did tried to force the DOJ to send letters to the different states demanding that they, don't certify Biden and do the alternate slate of electors. If he never took those other actions, do you think he would have been charged?
Impossible to say. All I could do is read what the indictment actually contains as allegations of what constitutes this supposed criminal conspiracy that Trump is guilty of conducting.
Yeah, because I don't think there's any way he would have been charged if it was just the rallies and he just did his speech. I think once you got to the fake electors slates, that became the real criminal issue. And to respond to some of your other points there, I know you brought up a free speech expert who says he's concerned by this, but there's also like
not just
free
an
speech
expert,
experts.
a defense counsel for
that.
one of the alleged
that.
co-conspirators.
No, I got you. But I'm saying there's also many free speech experts who think that Citizens United is about political speech, and I totally disagree with that. I think it's about political corruption. And there's also experts on the other side of this, like Bradley Moss. So it's not particularly persuasive to me. I find that just like an appeal to authority. To the idea that this is unprecedented and a novel application, I mean, I would argue almost anything we would do legally vis-a-vis what happened is going to be novel and unprecedented because we've never been here before. And the charge of conspiracy against rights, to me, I look at that and I say the reason why they did that charge is because it was an attempt to disenfranchise millions of voters if their scheme had succeeded.
Okay, so I'm not trying to appeal to authority. I'm just giving you an example of another person who's making an argument on the basis of free speech without being a Trump partisan. I mean, this guy happens to not even like Trump.
And we know you're not a Trump stick fan as well.
I understand
We're
the
just
point.
saying
I'm just saying there's experts on the other side of this
on either side of this. So there are people with fancy pedigrees that would say all kinds of things. That doesn't necessarily make them correct.
No, I'm not saying his pedigree makes him correct. I was just citing another example of someone making a similar case. So you propose a hypothetical of, what if Trump had only done such and such and not this, but charges have been brought? I mean, that's impossible to say. It's a counterfactual. What we can do is look at the actual text of the indictment, and what it does is it posits that a litany of Trump's political speech is being characterized as constituent elements of this overarching felonious conspiracy. So there's a reason why they list a whole bunch of Trump's tweets where he's criticizing state legislators, or he's attacking the Secretary of State of Georgia, or he's making all kinds of other, again, I think mostly harebrained comments about the lack of veracity of the election results. There's a reason why all that is cited by Jack Smith in this indictment as a component of the overarching conspiracy, because that's what he's saying is a part of the conspiracy, the speech. Now, is it the only element of the alleged conspiracy? No, there are other elements that are being posited. But the point is that he had to weave together this vast range of, this vast constellation of political conduct and put it under the umbrella of now a felony conspiracy.
So there's a few things there. I think the fact that you emphasize one component is, itself important because you acknowledge it's not the entirety of the indictment or what he's being charged for. I do think that, a person who allegedly committed crimes, talking about those alleged crimes is probably pretty relevant to, a jury in terms of figuring out whether or not they believe Trump is guilty on these. And I would also say, so in terms of my view, I think there are three pieces here that make the indictment, pretty solid and make it so that I support it. Because if we were in a situation where Trump had just given rallies and said all kinds of nonsense, I would not support that indictment against him. I would think that that was a violation of free speech rights. So to me, there are three key components that makes this legitimate. Number one is the fact that there was no significant amount of fraud. Number two is the fact that a reasonable person presented with all of the information that Trump was presented with would understand that there was no real fraud. And number three, that in spite of those things, you still concoct this elaborate multi-state scheme to try to, in effect, steal an election. So you said previously, that you didn't think any reasonable person would really expect that this was criminal behavior. They would think that this was just political behavior or political speech. I just really disagree with that. And in fact, you have people who were cajoled into being fake electors under false pretenses precisely because of the reason that they would understand that there was something wrong with what they were doing if they really understood what was going on. If I was personally, concocting this elaborate multi-state scheme involving some cockamamie legal theory on January 6th to try to steal an election, I would 100% understand that there was potentially something criminal about that. And, people like Bill Barr and others also, viewed it as likely criminal activity. So I just also disagree with the idea that this is totally wild and no one would have seen this as a problem or criminal behavior before.
Well, Bill Barr, despite having fallen out with Trump, as you know, still has prefaced his comments on this January 6th indictment by saying that there's a potential danger in criminalizing political activity. But you're right, he nonetheless thinks that the charges could be seen as legitimate.
As legit.
So
yeah.
on the question of the lack of fraud or a reasonable person not being able to conclude that there was actually significant fraud in the election, that's a matter of political contestation, or had been. Like, you could make an argument that there is no fraud of any significant import, and I would probably make the same argument, but then somebody else could make a countervailing argument, and then the idea, at least prior to August of 2023, is that that will be resolved in the realm of political disputation rather than by a prosecutor indicting your debate opponent with
Jack Smith.
But again, he's not being indicted because he, lied about the fraud, or because he believed about him or didn't believe him or whatever. He's indicted because there was no real fraud. He was presented with all sorts of information to indicate that there was no real fraud. He gave some indications privately that he knew some of these claims were, quote, crazy, at least when it came to Sidney Powell, and yet went ahead with these fake slates of electors and trying to overturn the results anyway. So it's those three pieces that you need. And if you didn't have one of those pieces, then you're right. It becomes difficult. And listen, they're going to have to, at trial, they're going to have to prove what he heard and what he knew and what he really thought about these claims, et cetera, is going to be a component piece. But without all three of those pieces, then, I think that this would fall apart. But if you don't have those three pieces, like, examples of, resistance, liberal, whoever, saying the Electoral College should do whatever last time around, sure, they, were saying things that were kind of wild, but they didn't create some fake elector scheme to also back it up with knowledge that what they were saying was completely false.
And I think Jack Smith thinks he can prove that Trump knew he was lying, because there's some indications of that in the indictment where, like you pointed out, Trump acknowledged to co-conspirator 3 that the rigged election claims were, quote, crazy. And then, of course, when he tried to get Mike Pence to overturn the results and Pence said no repeatedly, Trump said, quote, he said, quote, "You're too honest," to Mike Pence, implying he knows that this is dishonest. He wants him to do something dishonest. And then to your other point, just the idea that how would a reasonable person act in this scenario? Well, he was told by the vice president, senior leaders of the Justice Department, the director of national intelligence, the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the senior White House attorneys, senior staffers on the defendant's 2024 reelection campaign, state legislators and officials, state and federal courts. You had all these people who were like, this is not true, this is not real, you can't go down this path, and then he did it anyway. I mean, honestly, I'm at the point where I don't even think you need to prove that he knew he was lying, because a jury might think a reasonable person given this information wouldn't have gone forward with the fake elector scheme, and that's the crime.
But then he could just say that, the officials in various security state agencies that had been at loggerheads with Trump for his entire tenure told him one thing and he disagreed with it. And then.
But it wasn't just them.
It wasn't just them, else. Though. Other state legislators told him something else. Various other consultants that he was, interfacing with at the time told him something else. John Eastman, who
he was fishing for that answer, Michael,
was actually a professor of constitutional law, told him something else.
He was fishing for that answer, though, right?
Who is telling him what now to determine whether he's actually guilty of committing a crime?
Wasn't he fishing for that answer? If 90% of the people are telling you this is not real, and these are accredited, highly respected people, and then 10% are saying, oh yeah, it's real, and by the way, those people are like Sidney Powell, who's an absolute psychopath, he's clearly fishing for that answer, and he either knows this is bullshit or is willing to disregard the fact that it's likely bullshit to continue forward with the harebrained scheme. But I think the main point here is, the reason why I don't think this is about political speech is because if he didn't do the fake elector scheme, they wouldn't have a case, but they did the scheme.
Okay, well, the elector scheme is pursuant to a theory that John Eastman in particular had propagated around the supposed primacy of state legislatures in making modifications to election law and designating the electors who are rightly representative of the state's election outcome. So when you say that there's no such thing as, there was no significant fraud, okay, but there are multiple components to this theory, which again, I don't agree with on the substance.
Sure.
But one component of this theory was that the regulatory changes that were made for election administration in the various states, whether it was changing the deadline for when mail-in ballots could be received, or it was modifying signature verification provisions, or various other COVID-related measures that were taken to enhance the ability of people to vote by mail that were done ad hoc at the time, but could still be seen as defensible or justifiable given your point of view. That they're saying also is a component of why the veracity of the election results is called into question. Hence, why the president of the Senate, under this theory of the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, is endowed with the ability to make a discretionary judgment as to which slate of electors actually constitutes the legitimate electoral votes for a given state. So I'm not willing necessarily to, out of hand, accept that theory that I reject is therefore criminal. And I also do think that there's a legitimate argument that the submission of these electors is a component of speech, because if you submit what you believe to be a legitimate slate of electors for your state's vote, based on your legitimate theory that because of the COVID regulations or because of what you see as election fraud being so prevalent, or for whatever other reason, really, your political values dictate to you that the submission of this slate of electors is valid, and there's a constitutional theory which enables you to submit these electors. And nothing like this had ever been criminalized before, or even really been entertained as criminalizable. Then I think you are having your political activity infringed upon by the state.
Here's why I disagree with that, and Chris, I want you to jump in. So the secretaries of states and governors of these 7 states where they did the fake elector slates, they had already certified that Joe Biden won. So everything you're saying is certainly debatable prior to that occurring, but they had already done that. And by the way, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that they knew as they were going through this theory that it was not only wrong, but illegal. So in the indictment on December 13th, co-conspirator 1 and 5 had a conversation where they decided the plan is no longer to do fake electors in case Trump wins, but to do the fake electors no matter what. And by the way, they use the term fake electors. And there's even another portion in the indictment where they refer to their scheme as using fraudulent electors. They use the word fraudulent. And also the same day, a senior White House advisor in a meeting with Trump and co-conspirator and 2 other co-conspirators said, I don't know who wants to put their name on this thing because it's, quote, certifying illegal votes. So this was their own view of what they were doing. We're certifying illegal votes. We know that the Secretary of State and the governor
hasn't been cross-examined or adversarially scrutinized. So just you have to take that, and you can't really take that at face value, this narrative that Jack Smith is weaving. I mean, Jack Smith is
wouldn't you say there's a distinction there, though? Isn't there a distinction? Isn't there a difference between doing everything you said, but doing it before the Secretaries of States and the governor certify it, and doing it after? Aren't they very different, and isn't one of those things potentially criminal?
Well, no, because the theory here is that on January 6th is when the ultimate certification takes place, meaning that if a certain faction within a state contests that the governor or the Secretary of State had legitimately issued their certification of a certain slate of electors, then they're still entitled up until January 6th to orchestrate their own submission of electors and then leave it to the judgment of the president of the Senate or the vice president, Mike Pence, to decide which slate of electors is valid. Actually, in one of the memos that just got leaked to the New York Times by this guy Cheeseborough, who is also one of the co-conspirators cited in the indictment,
who has a hilarious last name.
Yeah, he quotes, he's a lawyer, he quotes a CNN.com op-ed piece by Van Jones and, oh God, who was the co-writer? It was... it's escaping my mind now. It's a very well-known Democratic a lawyer.
Well, if Van Jones said it, it must have been fine.
But they're saying that, look, in the event that there's any dispute about Pennsylvania's electoral votes, then Democrats should convene and submit their own rival slate of elections on January 6th.
But you said something. You said something key there, though. In the event that there is a dispute, a legitimate dispute, right? Of which there was none. Here. That there's some that there are some actual votes that were, a problem, that were potentially significant. I mean, a lot of this had been litigated in the courts. Augur and I also, spent a lot of time during that time period going through all the court filings to try to go piece by piece, take the claim seriously, and see what it all amounted to. And as you know, it all amounted to a whole lot of nothing. And we're able to figure that out. The freaking president of the United States was certainly able to figure that out. But I do think, to give some credence to your point, I asked an expert on these things who does support these indictments what Trump's best defense is here. And he pointed to what you're saying, basically like throw John Eastman under the bus, say this was the advice of counsel, and try to pin the blame on them. But the fact that you can find a lawyer to endorse your criminal scheme isn't some kind of like get out of jail free card. He clearly was shopping around for the answer that he wanted to get. And so the fact that you can find someone who, supports what's effectively criminal behavior doesn't mean that it wasn't in the end criminal behavior.
But again, when you say that there has to be some legitimacy to the dispute for it to be a non-criminal dispute, the notion of legitimacy or what constitutes legitimacy, that's a matter of political contestation.
But they called it illegal.
Your notion of what constitutes legitimacy is clearly different from what a whole lot of Republican state legislators thought constituted legitimacy.
But Michael, in their own correspondence, they called it illegal. Trump's counsel said in a meeting with Trump and two other co-conspirators that this would be, quote, certifying illegal votes. They called them fake electors. They didn't use the term alternative. They said fake electors. And then somebody came in after the fact and was like, hey, to cover our asses, we might want to use the word alternative instead of fake. Doesn't that show you what
John
they're
Eastman
thinking?
Never used that terminology. John Eastman, to this day, argues that his theory is completely valid under the 12th Amendment. I actually just posted a law review article by two Boston University law professors that was published in 2022, which, while not entirely endorsing the Eastman-Trump theory, does posit that the vice president or the president of the Senate, who's ever presiding over this ceremonial legislative hearing, does possess the only constitutionally afforded ability to make a discretionary judgment as to what slate of electors is valid and ought to be counted. Now, that doesn't seem necessarily correct to me, but I mean, you can't criminalize that, or at least it wouldn't have been cognizable for that to be criminalized.
Look, this is part of the indictment too. You're using fraudulent evidence, fraudulent documents of fake electors to then give it to Mike Pence. So they literally created a paper trail of their crimes. I'm with you, Michael. If it was just speech, I'd be on your side. I argued against Russiagate right next to you in the trenches because I thought it was totally bogus. I thought it was BS. But in this instance, he didn't just give speeches. They did the fake elector slates. They knew it was illegal. They knew it was wrong. They created a paper trail and they tried to force Mike Pence. And by the way, when I read through the whole indictment, I was amazed. Some of the stuff I didn't know. I was amazed at. So Trump repeatedly tried to, it wasn't just pressure Pence. It was like coerce Pence into doing this to the point where he came out on January 5th and said, the VP and I are in total agreement that the VP has the power to act. It was like his last ditch effort to like try to force him into doing it. Like, Mike, I already said that you're going to do it. So are you going to do it? I mean, this stuff is astonishing.
Yeah,
is it not?
He tweeted out an attempt to pressure Mike Pence. Like, when did attempting to pressure the vice president become a felony? And also on the issue of the electors being fraudulent. So you're telling me that all these Republican electors in the 6 or even 7 states, because they've thrown in New Mexico for some reason.
Correct, yeah.
They were cognizant at the time when they signed their names to these pieces of paper that they were committing felonies?
No, they were duped, and that's actually in the indictment too.
They submitted evidence of their felonious conduct to the National Archives, to the president of the Senate,
Michael,
to their own state's Secretary of State, and to the governor. So
this is part of the crime. They were defrauded.
Michael,
when they're committing a felony? Those people were defrauded. Those people were told, we're only going to use this in the case Trump actually wins the election. But then they had the conversation behind the scenes. No, we're going to use this no matter what. So they defrauded those poor people. They didn't know how this was going to be used.
Part of the allegations in the indictment.
Well, the electors in Michigan have been charged with felonies by the Democratic state attorney general, which I guess we're not supposed to care about either.
But part of the allegations in the indictment are that many of the electors, perhaps not all, but some of the electors were told effectively, like, we're only going to use this if we find enough fraud and it's, litigated in court, that we need these alternate slates. So in the event of like legitimate, actual, provable fraud that changed the results of the election, then your name is going to be used. So they had to be tricked, in effect, into signing their names to this because of the worry that they were, really doing something wrong. But I want to ask you a question because I want to understand a little bit more your position. So how far, like, what is conduct that Trump could have committed that you would look at and say, like, okay, yes, he deserves to be indicted. He deserves to be charged. This is criminal behavior. Like, if you had, for example, an audio tape where he's acknowledging he knows all of this is bullshit and like it's clear to him and he's going forward with the scheme anyway, would that be sufficient? Would it be sufficient if his scheme actually succeeded and he successfully pressured Mike Pence into doing this and like threw the whole election outcome into doubt and was like more successful with his scheme? Would that be far enough? Like, I'm just trying to get a sense of where are your lines that you don't think he crossed that would have led you to say, like, okay, I accept that this is criminal behavior.
Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.